In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to batch export a lot of meshes from your scene file in Maya and export them all at the same time as FBX, either to a single FBX file or into individual FBX files. So you can then import them into UE5 or UE4. This is great for many situations, primarily when you are working on modular meshes. Because if you have a lot of modular meshes, you have to bring each of them to world origin, add its pivot point, then export, rename, update, re-export. And if you have a lot of modular meshes, this takes a long time and it's very tedious. But with the Maya game exporter, you have an option to enable move to origin. So it doesn't matter where your mesh is in the world. It will automatically be placed at the world origin and exported every time you use the game exporter. This will greatly speed up your workflow. And I haven't seen a lot of people use this, but it's been available in Maya for a while. So let's dive into this. Here I have a scene open with a lot of modular meshes that I'm working with. Some of them have iterations upon iterations, and I keep everything in one scene so I can kind of test the modularity and see if they fit. Then I do updates and just kind of modify and continue modeling. So the standard workflow is in order to export each of these static meshes, I have to do it individually by taking a single static mesh, then moving it to world origin, snapping it at its pivot point at the 000 world space, then going to File, Export Selection, exporting it as FBX, making sure I have all the proper settings enabled, naming it, and then exporting it. Then I have to move that mesh back, and I would have to repeat this for every single static mesh. And with the amount of static meshes you have, and this is not a very large modular scene, but it's already a lot of work just with just a few of these static meshes. And you can imagine if you have a larger scene, it just takes way too long. That's very tedious. Now there are ways you can speed this up using the standard export option, and that's making sure that you freeze your transformation at the world origin. So you would just grab a static mesh, you can just zero this out, export, you add export selection to your custom tool shelf, then you export it, then you undo it to bring that back, and then you just repeat for all the other ones. So that kind of speeds up a little bit, but still, it takes a little bit of time for you to do this for every single mesh, especially if you need to constantly do this on each updated iteration. But there's a faster way to do all this, and that is to use Maya Game Exporter. So you'll find Maya Game Exporter on the File, Game Exporter. And by defining just a few of these settings, you can batch export an entire scene or a set of selected static meshes. And one of the best options that will save you a lot of time is this move to origin setting. By enabling this, it will move every single static mesh. After you run the game exporter, it will move it to the world origin and export it. But the actual static mesh inside your scene will not be moved. It'll just be in the same spot. So as long as you control that pivot point and use static mesh, it'll be placed at the world origin at that pivot point, exported within the FBX file. So when I import into UE5, the pivot point will be exactly where you need it to be. And you don't have to manually move this at the world origin to export. And this alone already will speed up your workflow. So let's cover this in more detail one by one and just go through all the options that you need for static meshes. And we're only going to cover how to do this for static meshes, for environment assets, such as architecture, props. No animation will be covered here. So the first thing you'll notice is at the very top, you have model, you have animation clips, and you have time editor. This allows you to game export a set of files depending on what you need to export. And we're going to be dealing with model. Then you have presets. So there's only one preset available for modeling, and these are the defaults right now. Once you get comfortable and you know what you need to enable and disable, you can create your own preset by adding a new preset. You can also then rename your preset. You can load an existing preset if you had it, and then you can save a preset once you've created it, and then you can delete the preset. And then once you create a preset, it'll be available through the drop-down menu here. The next option is for you to export. What do you want to export? Do you want to export the entire scene, all the objects within it, or do you want to export only a selection? I like to work with selections, so I know exactly what I'm exporting. But you can also export an entire scene. Every object in it will be exported. I'm going to go ahead and select export selection. So whatever I select, that's what will be exported. Next is defining the static mesh geometry and what type of settings do you want to export those static meshes with. So the two that we need to focus on is the smoothing groups. So if you have soft or hard edges, these will be exported with the object itself. So you want to make sure that that's enabled. And then also want to enable smooth mesh. I'll show you what smooth mesh actually does, but for right now, we're going to keep this enabled. You don't need to enable split vertex normals. You don't need skinning. This is for deformation. You don't need blend shapes. This is for animation and morph targets. And you don't need tangent and binormals. These two options, split vertex normals and tangent and binormals, you can disable, and they deal with more advanced rendering techniques for how that mesh will appear visually. So this is very advanced, and you kind of have to edit vertex normals and the normals on the mesh itself. So just to quickly show you, if I were to insert a cube, actually let's do a cylinder, just going to make it larger. Each object has a set of normals and vertex normals that appear for how that object will be rendered and shaded. To see those normals, I'm going to quickly go to Attribute Editor. On the Mesh Component Display, I will enable Display Normals and Display Tangents. And I'm going to make them larger. So let's do 10. So they appear larger in the viewport. So all of these kind of define how this object will be shaded and rendered. And if you were to edit these yourself, and you wanted to export that information with the object itself, then you will enable tangents and binormals. And the way you edit them, and again, you don't need to worry for 90% of meshes that you create for things like architecture and just basic props or even complex props. Most of the time, you're not going to be editing your vertex and your binormals or your tangents and binormals. You will be keeping them as they are. It's when you need to really tweak the object itself and to make it render differently and display visually, then you would edit these out. Usually, you'll do this for foliage. Trees, plants that need some kind of special treatment in order to edit these. But in order to edit these really quickly, you would go to Mesh Display. You can unlock the normals, and then you could Vertex Normal Edit Tool, and you'll be able to actually edit these normals and define how the objects will be shaded. You can see that it's already beginning to change just by manipulating and rotating the vertex normals on this object. And then again, if you wanted to export that data, you would enable this. But we don't need to deal with this at all. Most of your environment assets, you don't need to do this. For triangulate, you don't need to enable triangulate. When you import into UE5, the Unreal Engine does a pretty good job triangulating it for you. So Unreal Engine does triangulation for you. So you could enable this and triangulate it on export in Maya, or you can just let Unreal Engine to triangulate it for you. And I usually like UE5 doing that for me instead of Maya. But it doesn't really matter. The results are not going to be so drastic that you'll notice a difference. And then let me show you what the other two options are. The smoothing groups and the smooth mesh, which is commonly misunderstood what this actually does. Smoothing groups will export hard and soft edges on your meshes. So if I create a cylinder, each object has hard and soft edges that will be contained in the model itself. So if I hold Shift, right click hold, go to Soften Harden Edge and display Soft Edge Display, you can see that there are certain edges that are hard edges and there are certain edges that are soft edges. Dashed line is a soft edge, hard line is a hard edge. And that defines visually how this model will be rendered and shaded. And then you can adjust these edges and set them to a hard or a soft edge by selecting those edges, and you can set them to a soften edge or harden edge. And then when you export, you do want to keep that information in the object itself, in the model. So this is why you want to enable smoothing groups. So those hard and soft edges are kept with the static mesh itself. So you do want to have smoothing groups enabled. And smooth mesh will define what mesh gets exported as FBX. So in Maya, you can do smooth mesh preview by hitting the 3 key. This will give you a smooth mesh preview. It will subdivide your mesh and will show you what your mesh will look like higher poly and subdivided. Now, this is a bit more in-depth topic to go into, as well as the soft and hard edges in order for you to set them yourself. If you want more information on all this, I do have a course called Maya Foundation, where we cover all of this in depth. But basically, subdivision modeling is its own subset of modeling method that creates higher poly, higher resolution meshes. And 3 gives you a smooth mesh preview. And 1 takes you back to low poly mode. So If I see this mesh right now as a smooth mesh preview inside the viewport, and I do not have smooth mesh enabled, I have it turned off, and I go ahead and export this smooth mesh preview, it will be exported as what you see inside the viewport, and it will be imported into UE5 as what you see here. And if I press 1 and I export this version and I have smooth mesh disabled, this is what will be exported, the low poly cage, the low poly version. And that's what's going to be brought into UE5. When you enable smooth mesh, it doesn't matter which version you're looking at inside the viewport. It can be 1, it can be 3. Only the low poly, this version right here, the low poly resolution cage, will be exported and not the smooth mesh preview. It's kind of weird that you have to enable it in order for it to be exported, but just to show you really quick to make it even more clear, I'm going to go ahead and disable this. I'm going to enable 3, the subdivision mesh preview, and I'm going to use the regular standard method of exporting. So I'm going to go to export selection. Again, this is found under file, export selection. This is the old method, not the old method, but the standard manual method. And in the settings on the geometry, I'm going to make sure that I have smoothing groups on. So we match the smoothing groups here. And then I am going to disable smooth mesh. So basically I am using this version just to quickly export and show you. And then we'll get back to the game exporter options. So this preview right here, the smooth mesh preview, that's what's going to get exported. I'm going to overwrite the cylinder that I already have. It's going to give me an error telling me that the plugin will tessellate the mesh with smooth mesh preview according to the viewport. Then in UE5, I'm simply going to import the cylinder. I'm going to reset the default settings so everything is back to the default, so I don't have anything re-enabled, customized, and then I'm going to import. It brought in the material, so don't worry about the material. I'm just going to drag the cylinder static mesh. And you can see that that's the version that was exported. Back in Maya, if I select this mesh and I hit 1 to go to a low poly cage, the polygonal object, and I export that version, and I will continue to keep smooth mesh off, I'll just overwrite. Then I'll just simply re-import that static mesh, right click on that static mesh and re-import. Whatever we saw in the viewport, now that version was exported. So you can see when you have smooth mesh disabled and you happen to be working with subdivision levels and using 1 and 3 hotkeys to switch between polygonal object and subdivision mode, the smooth mesh disabled will bring in the mesh or export the mesh as you see it in the viewport. But if I enable smooth mesh preview and I export by enabling the smooth mesh option, and I'm going to override this, it will not matter if I have it viewable inside the viewport as a smooth mesh preview. Only the low poly, the polygonal object, will be exported and brought in. So if I re-import, you can see that this is the version that was brought in. It doesn't matter if how we see it in the viewport inside Maya. So the smooth mesh enables you to kind of make sure that the tessellated mesh, if you happen to press smooth mesh preview on by accident or not, basically just enables you to only export the polygonal object and not the subdivided object. So I usually keep smooth mesh on, and that's what we're going to keep for the game exporter. But if you happen to be working with subdivision and you're creating high poly meshes and using nanites in UE5 and you do want to have your models subdivided, pressing 3, creating the model and creating the high poly, the high resolution mesh, and then disabling smooth mesh allows you to export the smooth mesh preview version as if it's the completed mesh. It's very useful. Next is the settings section. Let me go ahead and delete this and come back to our modular meshes. You have an option of exporting to a single file. So whatever selection that you have made, because right now we have export selection enabled, so only the selection will be exported. And we can make sure that the selected meshes here are going to be exported into one single FBX file. Or you can choose to export to multiple files. That means that each of these meshes will be exported into their own FBX files and everything will be separate. You can choose one or the other. If you export to multiple files, you will have multiple FBX files to import. But if you choose a single file, you can also do this. You will have all the static meshes placed into one single file. And then inside Unreal Engine 5, in import settings, you'll be able to disable combined meshes. So then each of these meshes will be separated from one single file into their own static meshes inside the content browser. So how you choose this is up to you. You can do one or the other. I'm going to keep export to single file on for this time, just to show you what that looks like. And then maybe we'll do a version with multiple files. If you are going to use export to multiple files, and I will mention this again, the name of the mesh is very important. Name of the mesh becomes very important on either option that you choose, but whatever the name of your mesh right here, that's the name that will be assigned to an FBX file if you choose export to multiple files. So if you have bad naming convention, and let's say it's you have pcube or whatever other default name, that's the name that's going to be assigned to the FBX. If you choose single file, the name will also be kept and will be added as a postfix to the name of the mesh on import in UE5. So it's important that you start naming your meshes if you're going to use the game exporter, because that name will be assigned somewhere, and it's usually will be assigned in the file name as well as in the static mesh name inside UE5. The next important option you want to enable is move to origin. This means that you don't have to move each individual static mesh back to world origin yourself. Just let Game Exporter deal it for you. So that way you can create your environment, and as long as you control your pivot point exactly where you would want it on the mesh, this option will move on export to the world origin and do all the hard work for you. So you don't have to move this mesh at all. Just control that pivot point and let Maya export it at its origin. The next few options is animation, where you don't have any animation. These are static meshes, and that's all we're dealing with is environment, props, and architecture. Input connections, yeah, I keep that on. Up axis, I keep it at Y. And inside Unreal, on import, it converts it to the Z axis that Unreal uses. So we don't need to change anything here. Embed media, I can go ahead and disable this. We're not embedding any media, so we don't have any textures associated with it. But if you had textures and materials assigned, and you were going to import those textures and materials inside Unreal Engine 5, then you may want to keep this on. So I'll keep it on. For files of type, I keep it at binary. That's fine. And FBX version, I keep it whatever it gave me default. I usually like to use an older FBX version. They tend to be more stable, especially with new versions of Unreal. Sometimes maybe certain versions of FBX might not be compatible with the brand new version of Unreal. So I usually just kind of go down a version or two and never had any problems. So I'll just keep it with whatever version that Maya gave me by default, 2018. And then for the path, we basically choose a path where do you want to export all these meshes. So let me go ahead and select a set of meshes. And again, I want to point out, so this specific static mesh, the pivot point is in the center of the object. So that means that that pivot point will be placed in the world origin. So I'll show you what that looks like when we import. But many of these have their pivot points controlled very precisely. So let's just choose a bunch. I could have selected way more, but let's just keep it at this. And maybe select a few wrongly named ones so you get to see what the naming convention is. And my setting for right now is going to be export to single file. Let's choose a location, the path, for where all of these are going to be exported into. And I have just a test folder inside the project directory. I'm going to choose this, but you can export it anywhere you want on your computer. And then here you want to add a file name for the FBX file. Since this is going to be a single file, this is what it's going to add a prefix to the name of each static mesh on import in UE5. So that means if I name this, let's say I name this architecture, what it's going to do on import in UE5, it will assign a prefix of architecture and then add an underscore and name of each static mesh. That's going to be the name of each static mesh inside the content browser in UE5. So in this case, I'm just going to add SM for static mesh, because that's going to be my prefix. That's the prefix I want. But you can add any prefix you want. Just know that this will be added as a prefix to the name of the mesh in UE5. And then the name of the mesh. That's the important part you need to know about. So once I had these, let's go ahead and export. Choose a file name to export, and I did. Let's try it again, and done. And here is the single FBX file. That's the name, SM, and all the selected static meshes. All of the selected meshes that I have inside the scene are now contained inside the single FBX file. And back in UE5, let's go ahead and import the FBX file. So inside here, I'm going to create a quick folder, a test folder, and I'm going to name this test game exporter. And let's go inside that folder. So I'm going to take this FBX file and I'm just going to simply drag it right into the content browser to import. I'm going to reset everything to default so you get to see everything what I change. So I am going to generate missing collisions. Nice quick way to add collisions to your meshes instead of having to export them or create them and then export them. I am going to disable combined meshes. This is the important part. If you chose a single FBX file, you want to go ahead and disable this. So this way, each mesh that you had selected and now is contained within that one single FBX file, it will be split up into its own static mesh inside the content browser. So I'm going to go ahead and disable this. Then everything else is going to be a default. Then I'm going to scroll down and I am not going to import or create materials or textures. So basically, if I had any setup for materials and then I had texture set up in Maya, I could choose to create a new material on import into UE5 and then import any textures that were associated. I don't have that. And I tend to like to create my own materials instead of having them imported. Basically what this will do, it'll create a very simple material and assign it to a mesh. So it saves you an extra step, but you still have to set up your textures and so on and set up a more advanced material for that static mesh. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do not create material and I am not going to import textures. And that's it. Those are the only options that I have. And some other options, you can see here, file axis direction, Y up. Unreal Engine 5 recognized that the Y direction in Maya and it's going to convert it in order to work with UE5. So then I'm going to just click import all. It's going to give me problems or an error saying that I have a degenerate tangent basis. This is because I don't have any UVs for these objects. So all of these errors, if you see them, that's because you need to UV your meshes and I don't have any UVs done for these. That's why I'm seeing this. Once I UV the meshes and re-import them, this error will be gone. So here are all the meshes that I had selected and now they're imported. And you can see that the SM, that's the name of the file, FBX, that we named, that gets added as a prefix, and then an underscore and name of the object. And some of these objects were named correctly the way I wanted them, and other objects kept the default name, and that's what gets kept and added to your static mesh name. As you can see, it's very important to do a proper naming convention for the FBX file that you would want, and then for each static mesh, make sure you name the static meshes inside Maya, the models themselves, so that name will get carried over to UE5. And now let's take a look at the pivot points. The pivot points should be right on the object, right exactly where I had them in Maya, with the exception of one object, that pillar that had it in the center. So for example, if I drag this, the pivot point is exactly where I had it in Maya. So you can see this is the door, pivot point is right there. Usually you would have to bring that to world origin, but with Game Exporter, this option was enabled, so it exported correctly, exactly where I wanted, and I never had to move this. And then we have this pillar, I believe. No, that's the correct pillar. Here's the pillar that had it right in the center. So now that pivot point will always be in the center unless I modify it back in Maya and re-import it. Or you could modify pivot point and save it to the object inside Unreal Engine using the modeling mode. And I do have a video for how to modify existing pivot points on static meshes inside Unreal if you ever need it. So that way you don't have to re-import. And one last option I want to show you is being able to choose to export to multiple files. So again, I'm going to stick with export selection unless you want to change it to export all. Means the entire scene will be exported into individual files. But I'll just do a selection again. That way I don't have to deal with all of these files. I'm going to go ahead and delete this static mesh FBX file. It's all clean, all clear in that folder. Let's just go ahead and select a set of static meshes. Doesn't really matter. Just want to select a set so you get to see what that is going to look like. So the options are going to kept the same, except for now it's going to be export selection and export to multiple files. Same path gets defined, and here you can add a prefix to each static mesh, or if you don't add anything here and export it as is. Basically, it will use the name of the mesh as the FBX file. Let's go ahead and export. And if I take a look at this now, see each and every single selected model from Maya has been exported as FBX. All of them have been moved to world origin, exported. And if I were to bring every single one of these into UE5, that would be brought in with this static mesh name as the name of the mesh. It looks like it did the SM. Let me do this again. Let's say I don't want that SM prefix. So let me go through this again. So it's going to be in this folder. Yes, choose. I don't want any prefix. So let's try it again. Export selection, export to multiple files. And here we go. That SM was removed. I guess it kept it. I guess I didn't delete it. It was gone, but it still added it. So I just had to redo it. So now all these meshes kept the name of the mesh as the FBX file. And that's what the name will be of the static mesh when you import it into UE5. So using the game exporter, you now have a very powerful tool set for you to export many meshes from the same scene file, speed up your workflow a lot, especially if you're working on modular meshes. And if you want to learn more about Maya, how to use Maya, how to control the pivot points, and how to model NUV completely from scratch as a beginner in Maya, take a look at a very extensive home study course, Maya Foundation, that I created. The course contains over 65 videos and 18 hours of tutorial knowledge information, and it'll teach you everything you need to know how to model environments in Maya as well as UV them.